It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin. How's our volume? Okay, well, I suppose there's one thing I'd ask of you. Just please stay awake. I know it's late in the day. Or failing that, just stay. So, well, following on from Richie and his look at Welsh miners, I'm going to be focusing on men of one particular tunnelling company, 179 Tunnelling Company. And I've been researching these men and what they did for nearly 10 years, actually since 2004, when I decided that I wanted to write a book about mining at La Boiselle, and set about finding as much as I possibly could about the mining, but also realised that I had to find out about the men as well. 179 Tunnelling Company was based in this sector on the Somme from August 1915 until July 1916 and the opening of the Battle of the Somme. They dug most of the tunnels there. Another tunnelling company, 185, was also there for about 4 months as well. So, Richie has explained that the tunnelling companies were composed of men transferred from the infantry and men directly enlisted from the collieries at home. And I'm going to look, first of all, at the miners, and then I'll move on to the officers. So who were the miners? Well, here's some of them. Here are some of them. A group photograph taken in Albert, sometime late 1915, early 1916. And we have a mixture of both men transferred from the infantry and men directly enlisted from home. And as to who the little girl is, we still don't know. We've put the photo in the local paper in Albert, but we haven't been able to identify her. So men transferred from the infantry. A very important part of these tunnelling companies, because of course they were improvised. These units, as Richie and others will have indicated, formed from scratch in a very short period of time. Corporal William Lynch, we can see here with his family, was in fact an army reservist, served in the Irish Guards, 1901, 1902, then became a miner in St Helens, recalled August 1914, and then transferred to a tunnelling company, 170, wounded, and on recovery is one of the first NCOs with this newly formed tunnelling company, 179, formed at Rouen, July 1915. So men like him were very important. He had experience in the army, he'd had some experience at the front as well, and so it really puts the lie to this idea that all the tunnellers were just rushed over from the UK with no front line or no military experience. William Lynch didn't actually serve very long at La Boiselle. He was killed on the 26th of September 1915, along with the rest of his section, as it were, RE equivalent of a section, killed by a British charge blown without properly evacuating the British galleries. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So the way that these men were got from the infantry was really by a mixture of bribery and cajoling by the famous John Norton Griffiths. By now, all of you should know who Sir John Norton Griffiths was. This mining engineer, civil engineer, entrepreneur, who was really the unofficial staff officer in charge of mining on the Western Front in 1915 and early 1916. And he was touring units at the front in 1915, trying to persuade battalion commanders and brigade commanders to hand over any miners that they had to him. And he'd use bribery, of course. The trouble was he would simply asked the miners to come forward, or units to offer their miners up, and units would respond by getting rid of troublemakers. Some of the troublemakers weren't even miners. But what he did get was this valuable backbone, especially the territorials. At La Boiselle, on the Somme, the first British unit to take over from the French, July 1915, was the 51st Highland Division. And amongst their ranks, especially in battalions like the 7th Black Watch, the 5th Battalion, were very large numbers of miners. There were even some mining officers, mining engineers serving as officers. So the 179 immediately gets a very strong Scottish flavour to it. Other units approached by Norton Griffiths included the Cheshire Regiment. Peter showed you this photo. Here is the unphotoshopped version of it, as supplied by his grandson. And the man on the right is Sapper John Grady, formerly Private Grady of the 1st Cheshires, born in Hoboken, New Jersey. Had returned to the UK. His family was from Ireland. He came to the UK in 1910, enlisted in the Cheshires, and was in fact a regular soldier. He may just have been a miner in Hoboken, New Jersey, but there's no evidence to suggest that. He did, however, have an extremely long crime sheet. And so, the 1st Cheshires approached 22nd of August 1915 to provide miners. 16 were sent, including John Grady. And he'd been actually a cotton operative in Oldham in 1910 before enlisting, so I don't know if he ever was a miner. September 1916, sentenced to 12 months hard labour for drunkenness, but the sentence was suspended and then remitted. And Richard was talking about these the crimes that tunnellers are committing. Drunkenness is the biggest enemy, I suppose, of efficiency within the tunnelling companies. Drunkenness is what they really came down heavily on. However, at the same time, if you sentence him to 12 months hard labour, that's actually a skilled man that you're potentially losing from the unit. And so frequently these sentences were suspended, as in the case of John Grady, and in fact it was then remitted. So he never had to serve that sentence. In fact, he received a head wound, discharged from the army, January 1918, married the nurse who'd cared for him. As for the other men, we don't know who they are. The family law, his grandson told me that they were told that one was a Scots Canadian, the other a Connaught Ranger, but we don't know who they are. However, as well as having a long crime sheet, he was a brave man. And the family also have this commendation sheet, commendation form, issued by General Maxey for an incident in September 1915, 5th of September 1915. When the British take over at La Boiselle from the Somme, part of the whole process by which we took over the Somme battlefield, the Somme front line from the French in July of 1915, La Boiselle was one of the mining hotspots where the frontline trenches were so close together that underground warfare had already been in progress for many months, and the front line was already a line of craters. And we took over from the French a dozen mine shafts in the front line, many of which were only 25 or 30 yards away from the German front line. These mine shafts went down 30 or 40 feet below ground, and the French had found that no matter what they did in terms of detonating charges from galleries runoff from these 40-foot shafts, they could not stop the Germans coming towards them. And the reason for that was that, as the British were later to realise, the German tunnels were actually at 80 foot below ground. So it's impossible to stop it's impossible to destroy a tunnel that's 80 foot below ground by detonating a charge from 40 foot below ground, because the force of the explosive will just go up to the surface. The big problem with these shafts was also the distance from the German front line, 25 yards. The Germans were constantly mortaring these shaft heads. And at that time, the British didn't have any adequate trench mortars to reply. Repeatedly, in September of 1915, October, November, the British shafts that they've taken over from the French are just being destroyed. by trench mortars. And the 5th of September 1915, the Germans managed to land a trench mortar bomb onto the shaft head, collapse the shaft head, and actually trap the miners who were working 40 foot below ground. And so Grady is commended for carrying out that rescue. So we'll stay with crime for the time being. This is from the service record of another 179 tunneler, Sapper McGarrigle. And I mentioned about leniency towards tunnelers because they were valuable troops. And as these miners are being brought into the tunnelling companies, there is a realization amongst the BEF, in the BEF, that these are valuable troops, that they're not used to military discipline, and therefore there has to be some leeway. So those men who have been directly enlisted from collieries have had their 10 days or so at Chatham. They've had a bit of rudimentary drill, but they haven't really been through that whole process where the army takes a man and breaks him down and builds him up again. They're still their own men, and this comes through very clearly in their crime sheets, but also in the way that the tunnelling companies deal with them. And they deal with them, I think, in quite an enlightened way. So here we have part of McGarrigle's crime sheet. Now, he already has been found guilty of desertion. He has failed to turn up for his parade, for duty in the front line, for his working shift. He's basically gone and hidden himself somewhere. He's gone missing at 3:45 when he's supposed to parade, and they don't find him till 9 p.m. So he is deserted when on active service. He could be shot for this. Instead, he is sentenced to 3 months field punishment number 1, commuted to 24 days. So all he has to do is serve 24 days field punishment number 1. Then, however, he does it again, which is what we can see here, March 1916, absent from the working parade until they find him in billets the following morning, absent for 9 hours, and sentenced to 7 days field punishment number 2, and the remainder of the service sentences remitted from the time that he's been to the front. So basically they are, again, being as lenient as they can, but then he does it again, 28th of March, and at the same time he's found drunk. So this time, really, they can't ignore it. He gets 9 months imprisonment with hard labour. He serves his sentence, and he returns to the unit. So what we can see is the tunnelling company trying to be as lenient as possible with these men. Now, they weren't all troublemakers. This is another man transferred from the infantry, from the 4th King's Own. He had been an iron ore miner at the Hodbarrow mines near Lancaster. And that same incident on the 5th of September, when John Grady is commended for rescuing the men trapped in the collapsed mine shaft, he gets the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Now, wartime photographs are notorious, really, for the misidentification of soldiers. People are always recognizing their relatives, I think, in group photographs or the Somme film, etc. So your guess is as good as mine. If this is the same man, if this is Alfred Graves in this group photograph, which is the one that I showed you part of at the beginning. So this photograph shows men of 179 Tunnelling Company in Albert, late 1915, early 1916, and you will notice that some men have cap badges, some don't, and they have a mix of equipment. So the men with the cap badges, generally speaking, are the men who have been directly enlisted into the Royal Engineers. The men without cap badges are the men who have been transferred from other units, like Graves from the King's Own, who have been told to take down their original badges. And they're in the process of being transferred to the Royal Engineers, a process which took months of bureaucracy, during which time these men without cap badges would have been waiting for their extra pay. And there are instances of men who have transferred at Norton Griffiths' instigation on the promise that they'll get extra money, 2 shillings and twopence as opposed to 1 shilling, and are still waiting for that many weeks afterwards. But eventually it comes through. So this photograph has come to us via the descendants of George Maule, this man here, who has directly enlisted from the Somerset coalfield. He'd been working underground certainly since the age of 14, which he appears in the 1911 census. Here, he's 18 years old. He'd been a carting boy in 1911. So this process of finding men for the tunnelling companies from collieries at home was one, as Ritchie said, fraught with the business that large numbers of men were enlisted who were simply unfit. And this came about for a number of reasons, but in particular, those men who are being targeted are the most experienced miners. And every man who enlists from home, from his colliery, has to provide a letter from his employer to prove that he is an experienced miner. So there are many of these that survive in soldiers' service records. So here's one from Castleford, Walter Richardson. And you can see it's telling us that he has worked at these collieries for the last 30 years. And men officially, initially from the age of up to 40 were accepted, and then 45. But as Ritchie has indicated, many men were older than that, and many men lied about their age. But the army wanted the older miners. And this might seem counterintuitive to go for all these old codgers, but the reason was twofold. Firstly, the younger men, especially the unmarried men, were being scooped up for the infantry, and those were the men that were being targeted for the infantry. But also for these tunnelling companies, what we really wanted were the most experienced men, the older, the hewers, the men who might have been working as miners, working at the face from perhaps the age of 19 or 20, and had massive experience, both of work underground, but also the physical strength that had been developed over decades. Hence, they had to provide the letter saying that they were experienced miners. So here's a number of these. Now, Norton Griffiths, very much a loose cannon within the BEF and the War Office. And the War Office and BEF really, to a great extent, let him get on with things. They gave him quite a long leash, and this did cause quite a number of problems with his unorthodox methods. Norton Griffiths suggested his own contact to be assessing officers and men for their suitability in the tunnelling companies. And this is a chap called George Miles Bailey. George Miles Bailey was in fact a retired stockbroker. And I've been unable to fathom why on earth Norton Griffiths appointed him to assess the suitability of tunnellers, miners and mining officers. And in fact, Norton Griffiths then fell out with Miles Bailey because he began countermanding his recruits that he'd sent out to France. And he realised that he'd made a big mistake. So here's Miles Bailey. Here's Miles Bailey putting forward a man for work as a tunneller, William James Seymour, and he's recommending him for to be a 6-shilling tunneller. So we've heard a little bit about this disparity of pay between men in the tunnelling companies. And on the establishment of the tunnelling companies, you had a provision for a limited number of skilled tunnellers who would be earning 6 shillings a day. So in a company with an establishment of 330 men, maybe just 30 would be the full 6-shilling tunnellers. And the rest of the miners would be on 2 shillings and twopence a day. They would be known as tunnellers' mates. But Miles Bailey is signing this certificate to say that William Seymour is suitable to be enlisted at 6 shillings a day. And this, once he was enlisted at 6 shillings, the army had to pay him that regardless. Now, I don't believe there's necessarily any evidence that William Seymour had any experience as a miner or tunneler. Miles Bailey thought he was a clay kicker, one of these special sewer navvies able to use this technique of working through clay. And a number of these are recruited in London and end up in 179 Tunnelling Company on a permanent pay rate of 6 shillings. And they're working alongside these hewers who've been 30 years underground who are only earning 2 shillings and twopence. Now, we have no record of what the result was in terms of personal relations between the men, but it obviously was going to be causing problems. This is another document from William Seymour's service record. He served 156 days with the tunnellers, and he was one of 5 men whose bodies were not recovered when the Germans blew a 12-ton charge, that's £40,000, at La Boiselle on the 19th of December 1915. And this is a letter from his widow attempting to recover his personal effects. So there were other types of troublemakers in the tunnelling companies. So here we have another group photograph taken the same location as the earlier group photograph, and we're interested in this chap here, who seems to be at the centre of things. He was a man of quite a lot of influence within his community. There he is on the left, Tom Hill. And Tom Hill remained a humble sapper throughout his time in the Tunnelling Company. He was never promoted as a non-commissioned officer. In 1910, he'd actually been elected president of the Cadeby Main branch of the Yorkshire Mine Workers Association. He was a trade unionist. 1911, he'd been nominated the check weighman at Cadeby Main Colliery. The check weighman is the independent checker of each miner's truck of coal. He's not employed by the coal company, but the coal company is obliged to allow him on the premises to make sure that each miner is paid fairly. 1913, he was elected to the Conisbrough Parish Council as a Labour member. Now, his enlistment was not opposed by the authorities. The only difficulty raised as to enlisting him into the tunnellers was that he couldn't get the letter from the coal owner because the coal owner didn't employ him. And the recruiting officer in Westminster said simply, this man will be quite all right for the tunnelling companies. Now, when he was actually downgraded, he was demoted from being a tunneller to a tunneller's mate. And this occurred because for those men who enlisted at 2 shillings and twopence a day, and this is really all the men who enlisted from coal mines in 1915, they had to sign up at the basic rate of 2 shillings and twopence, even though they'd heard that you could get 6 shillings. And they were told that they could only qualify for the 6 shilling rate if they were judged to be efficient enough when they were at the front. And Tom Hill managed to get himself upgraded, remustered to the 6 shilling a day rate, but then subsequently was disrated for inefficiency. And his response was to get a member of Parliament to write to the War Office, and in due course, the following month, he is upgraded again. Whether the two have any connection, I don't know. Chap on the right, Tom Cusack. He joined up in 1915, age 48, claimed to be 40, The other thing he failed to mention was that he was a prominent organiser for the Navvies Union in Stoke-on-Trent. Previous month he'd forced a war bonus of 15.5% for colliery surface workers from the North Staffs Colliery Owners Association. He was one of the men buried alive at this incident on the 5th of September 1915 when the trench mortar collapses the shaft. He was rescued after being buried alive for 3 hours, rescued alive, invalided home. Within a month, he's appearing on a recruiting platform in Stoke-on-Trent alongside the mayor to call for more volunteers. He also got a member of parliament to write to the War Office to complain about the fact he wasn't getting 6 shillings, but he didn't get the 6 shillings. So on the subject of unionisation, there's one anecdote about miners who tried to strike at Hill 60 and were told by their officer that if he could find the ringleader, he'd have him shot. And they did go back to work. One of the 179 Tunnelling Company officers, Captain Hugh Kerr, in 1959, was interviewed by the author Alexander Barry, and he talked a lot about work at La Boiselle. He talked about his miners. He said, I didn't have to offer my miners any special inducement to work. They were as keen as mustard. I had one old miner who said, "Cor blimey, if the trades unions knew what we were doing here, there wouldn't half be a row." The men who join up direct from the collieries, very often a group will join up together. These two men, Ezekiel Parks and John Lane, were killed together on the 22nd of November 1915, 80 foot below ground, by a German charge, 2.7-ton charge, which detonated a British mine charge that had been laid in readiness. They were probably listening at that British mine charge. Their bodies were never recovered. Just see, Ezekiel Parks' identity bracelet was actually returned to his family mysteriously because their bodies were never found. It's quite possible that they were blown to pieces by the detonation of the British charge, and so pieces of them were found. Hugh Kerr, that I quoted before, related another anecdote. He said one time when he was backfilling a British charge, tamping in preparation for blowing the British charge, he was doing that himself. It was important work. He said, I turned around to the sergeant and said, come along, give us another half bag for the top here. The sergeant tears open a sandbag of spoil. He said, there was this most frightful stench. I knew what it was. We'd lost a couple of men, and this was probably a bit of humanity. It didn't worry them. The sergeant said, "Cor Christ, it's a little bit of old Joe. Cor blimey, he ain't half doing his bit." At La Boiselle, the grandson and great-grandson of John Lane have been to the shaft head at 30 foot below ground, which goes down to that 80 foot level where both Parks and Lane's bodies are remaining. So another direct enlistment, William Arthur Lloyd. There's William Arthur Lloyd there. Here he is at home in New Broughton in Wrexham. William Arthur Lloyd's father had been killed in the pit when he was age 16. Already he was himself a miner. And that may have induced him to marry the colliery manager's daughter. And he ended up running, I don't think that's her, to be honest, but you know, anything to get out of the pit. He ended up running the miners' club. His family say that he was still working underground. And here he is, after enlistment. I'm assuming he's not yet been issued with a cap, because he's just put his cap badge here. And this is part of the last letter that he wrote home. And he was killed on this, the same incident on the 19th of December, this massive £40,000 German mine charge. And we often hear about the sort of beautiful writing that all soldiers from the First World War are supposed to have. And those of us that spend a lot of time looking at soldiers' letters from the First World War know that the majority that have been saved are from the what we might call the white-collar class, those that are joining up the smarter PALS battalions. The few surviving letters from, for example, tunnellers give us a better picture, a true picture perhaps, of literacy in Britain. He says, Lloyd says in his last letter, there's bits of family news, and then suddenly he says, all I can tell you is I wished the war was over. It is a murderous one. And he also, on the back of here, writes a letter specifically to his son. He says, I'm very glad you've started work. All the same, I want you to be a good lad to your mother. Be obedient. Look after her all right. You'll never get another one like her. If I come home, I shall never forget you if you do as I tell you. So in December, we'll be taking 3 generations of descendants of William Arthur Lloyd down to the 80-foot level where the collapsed tunnel is all that's left of where William Arthur Lloyd and 4 comrades are still lying. So the born fighters that I promised you. Standing at the back is Samson Farnell. He was one of 5 brothers who were all coal miners and all enlisted. Now, we don't know who these other 2 chaps are, whether they are brothers. I think because they're both in the engineers, they're maybe just his mates. He joined up age 28, middle son, and both he and his younger brother Richard enlisted in the tunnels. Both, we know from newspaper reports, had been in court for fighting before the war. In 1911, Samson was fined for assaulting a woman whose husband he'd gone to the house of to have a fight with. Maybe he couldn't get past his wife, so he hit her instead. And Samson Farnell lost his life 2 days before Christmas 1915, and he's another of these tunnellers who die of alcoholic poisoning. It's actually recorded that he died of heart failure following alcoholic gastritis. And he's buried at the cemetery near to the dressing station where the post-mortem was carried out, Norfolk Cemetery at Baycore. 6 months later, his brother, serving with a neighbouring tunnelling company, 178 Tunnelling Company at the Tambor, was buried in the same cemetery. And 3 of the 5 brothers were killed. So drink, as I said, was the major enemy of efficiency in the tunnelling companies. And the tunnelling company commander would have some sanctions against that. And in fact, the commander of 179 Tunnelling Company used control of leave. So he said that no miner would get any leave home if, unless their crime sheet was free of any crimes of drunkenness for 3 months. And he boasted that he had almost eliminated drunkenness at the end of 1916 using that method. So they had a few sanctions like that. And of course, he had this sanction of disrating a man if he was inefficient from this 6 shilling rate to the 2 shillings and 2pence rate of a tunneller's mate. And they'd have a slip that would be signed. So the tunnelling company commander, Henry Hance, has signed it here. Just barely a fortnight before the opening of the Somme offensive, the most critical time for 179 Tunnelling Company in terms of getting ready for the attack. And you can see here that he's been disrated as a tunneller to a tunneller's mate for laziness. So if you're not pulling your weight, you could be given a very dramatic reduction in pay. So who is going to control these men? Well, on its formation, the 179 Tunnelling Company has several hundred men who come in from the UK. They're split up between two tunnelling companies, and one rather hapless regular army officer, who we'll meet in a moment, is there to control them, and he has no one else. Corporal Lynch, that we saw at the very beginning, is sent to him, and then he gets some regular non-commissioned officers from Chatham. Here's a couple of them. This is the man that becomes a company sergeant major, Robert Powell. He's aged 36, and he's with the 179 Tunnelling Company for most of its time. And the senior NCOs would be the only regular sort of professional soldiers with the tunnelling companies by about the end of 1915, because they lose their regular commanders. So it's these men who have to keep some sort of order. This man, Henry Bullen, getting married in Chatham, December 1915, age about 29. Now, again, these men must have employed some sort of a light touch. But I think if we think about the qualities that the army wanted out of soldiers, and think also about the qualities that miners have almost inbred into them, there is quite a lot of overlap. So the army will take a recruit and wish to build up his physical strength and stamina. They will wish to instill in him the ability to work in conditions of danger, often constant danger. And above all, a soldier will need to trust his mate, trust the man next to him with his life. And these are exactly the qualities which miners will already have. So there is this big gamble that the War Office seems to be taking in just enlisting these miners and after 10 days at Chatham, sending them out to the front line. But in fact, the tunnelling companies are so effective, firstly because miners have these qualities, and secondly because the War Office, the BEF, let them get on with it. They have officers who are mining engineers, but they let them get on with it. Now, I'd like to move on to officers, hoping that we're okay for our time. So, the regular officer, who is the first commander of 179 Tunnelling Company, Eric Alabaster, son of a British diplomat born in Shanghai in 1915, is aged 28. He's seen here a little earlier in his life at Chatham. He's never commanded a company. He served, however, for 5 years at Dover with a fortress company, so he has some experience of tunnelling. He grows to detest mining, but he was popular amongst the other officers. This is part of one of his many letters home to his wife from the 16th of October 1915. I'll read part of it because it gives you a flavour of what happened to a man who did not have the experience, the skill, the temperament to be in command of a tunnelling company. And many of the regular officers, regular engineer officers who are given command of tunnelling companies do not get on very well. One of them, famously a VC winner, lasted 2 weeks and managed to get himself posted away. Alabaster lasted a lot longer than that. So here he says, "To my own darling Wendy wife, I do feel upset. Everything seems so well in hand. Now a message has come down to say that the Germans have fired a mine and killed 3 of my men. It is horrible. I love my men and simply can't bear losing any one of them. Of course, this is war. We must expect casualties, and we're trying to kill each other by every means we can. But it doesn't alter the fact that the loss of any of my brave men upsets me no end. If it was in a charge, when we were all taking the same risks, it would be all right, but to have my lads blown in while I'm not with them, honey, love, it makes me feel rotten. If it weren't for you, I'd go out on my own and have a smack at the brutes in the open and be laid out and be done with it." And he goes on in the same vein. And he is sacked. First he knows is when a temporarily commissioned mining engineer turns up with orders to take over command of his unit. And the ultimate reason why Alabaster is sacked is that accident on 26th of September, when 9 of their men are killed by their own charge, where they failed to ensure that all of their galleries are cleared of their own personnel before they blow a charge underground. Hants is a very different kettle of fish. And the sort of last part of the talk, I'm going to talk about mining engineers and the officers. So, how many of you remember that Richard Hannay, hero of the 39 Steps, published in 1915, John Buchan's thriller, was a mining engineer. And I think John Buchan chose mining engineer because it perhaps epitomized the spirit of the British adventurer, going out into the empire, doing a dangerous job, but actually being pretty well paid for it. And the officers, the temporarily commissioned officers for the tunnelling companies, were sourced from both coal mines at home and from all sorts of mines overseas in the empire and beyond. And typically, the first question that would be asked of an officer arriving at a tunnelling company would be coal or metal, because the other officers wanted to size him up. Was he from a coal mine in the UK, or was he one of the more adventurous types like Ritchie, who'd gone all over the world and made his fortune? And it was and it was held that it was held by those who were the mineral miners from all over the world that they were far more adventurous and daring than the coal miners. And that, I would say, that's not borne out by the record of many of the coal miners, coal mining engineers. Hants, this man, born in Liverpool actually, on his mother's side of the family, there were coal mines, but he had been a mining engineer in India. When he arrives at La Boiselle to take over command of 179 Tunnelling Company, he's already won the Military Cross for tunnelling at Givenchy, and he replaces Alabaster because John Norton Griffiths recommends that the tunnelling company needs a good, strong man to take over. And he's one of the first non-regulars to command a tunnelling company. This is a big step in that the BEF is handing over command of these new units to non-professional soldiers. Hants embarks on a massive program of mining at La Boiselle, takes on the Germans underground at this 80-foot level, and ultimately beats them. He is the man who really achieves these two massive mines blown on the 1st of July 1916, the Lotnagar mine and the Weissap mine. He was an experienced miner. His fellow officers hated him. Now, if you'll just indulge me, I want to read another excerpt from the interview with Hugh Kerr, one of his officers who hated him. He was a first-class rascal. He was loathed by everybody up and down the line, all over the place, but he had a very loyal, very good crowd of officers. He was always out for number one. He hated the ordinary private soldier. When he did leave, it was the happiest day the company had ever known. I think they all got blotto that night. But what Hants possessed, and what Alabaster didn't possess, was the mental strength, the ruthlessness, and actually a very powerful hatred of the German that meant that he pushed himself and he pushed his men. Hants was constantly underground, constantly in the front line, listening for hours, day and night, because that was the only way you could determine what the enemy was actually doing. When the Germans blew the massive mine on the 19th of December, it was Hants who rallied the infantry and made them man the new crater lip. He's to win the DSO, and the MC ultimately survives the war. So these temporarily commissioned mining engineers, they have a couple of weeks at Chatham. Now, it's not really to train them, but obviously they have to learn how to become temporary gentlemen, so they have to learn how to salute and that sort of thing. It's more, these 2 weeks at Chatham are more to assess their knowledge and suitability than to train them. So here we have a group. This chap here is the one we're interested in, Stanley Crossland Bullock. He's worked in Siberia and Australia. In 1914, he was managing a copper mine in Chile. and he gave up that job, what must have been an extremely well-paid job, to enlist. Here he is with his family. Here is an idea of the impact of the war on him over 3 years. Another example with 179 Tunnelling Company, Leo Dory Ford. Leo Ford, born in Johannesburg, worked in British Columbia, worked in Newcastle upon Tyne. In 1914, he was assistant colliery manager in India. He survived. On the left, Stanley Ramplin Jones. In 1914, he was a consulting mining engineer in Singapore. Norton Griffiths particularly detested Ramplin Jones. He'd actually got his commission from the Governor-General in Malaya. Norton Griffiths probably didn't like him because he hadn't personally selected him. He called him I am it Jones, and he was got rid of. And on the right, Eric Mackay-White won his military cross, probably for that same incident in September 1915 with a collapsed mine charge. Mackay-White was born plain white, Eric William White, and he had emigrated to Canada in 1910 and changed his name. He'd added the Mackay to his name. When he enlisted in the Canadian Forces, he gave his uncle as his father. And the reason for that, and the reason why he'd emigrated in the first place, was that his father had committed suicide at his engineering firm in Wolverhampton in 1910, and Eric had found his body with a revolver. So he was, in a sense, escaping his past. Worked as a mining engineer, a journalist. Also, he claims a bushman in Canada. Here he is in Chatham. He was invalided with neurasthenia after 4 months at La Boiselle. Now, these men, many of them were very experienced. So the men we've seen so far were very experienced. Other men were not so experienced. Cecil Calvert, son of a famous British mining engineer who developed gold mining in Western Australia. Calvert grew up in Hampstead, went to Harrow School, the Royal School of Mines. Royal School of Mines was the key source, actually, for the tunnellers. Camboard featured very strongly. I haven't come across many from the Welsh School of Mines. I don't know if you can remember that. But the Royal School of Mines was the key conduit that they were getting recruits from. Calvert was one, but he lacked experience. And he was dead within a month of arriving at the front. He was killed by carbon monoxide, gassing, after a German mine blow, killed because he was inexpertly using a breathing apparatus. This man, Geoffrey Thompson, a little more experienced, son of the general manager of the Prudential Assurance Company, studied at McGill University, Montreal, had been working in Burma in 1914. 1 week after arrival, he was the shift officer when the 9 men were killed by the British £1,000 charge. And he was reprimanded for that. It must have been a devastating introduction to him 1 week after arriving at the front to have been held responsible for that. He was killed 3rd of September 1916 by a British shell at High Wood after the blowing of a trench using a push pipe. More experienced men, Wilfrid Creswick, colliery manager from Wakefield, wounded serving with the infantry, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, posted to 179 Tunnelling Company, was a section commander, awarded the Military Cross. By April 1916, when Stanley Bullock arrived, was posted to his section, Bullock recalled that he was already losing his nerve. The stress of the 6 months that he's been serving with the Tunnelling Company was beginning to tell. 10th of April 1916, Stanley Bullock describes in his memoirs how the thing that they dreaded most had occurred. They had broken into a German mine gallery 80 foot below ground underneath no man's land. It was Creswick, who was the senior man. Creswick and 2 miners entered the German gallery, and very soon afterwards, the Germans blew a pre-prepared charge. So Creswick and the 2 miners were buried alive and their bodies were not recovered. His daughter, his younger daughter, was born 4 months after his death, and only in 2006 did she learn how her father had actually lost his life. The other chap, Humphreys, is one of those Scotsmen, the Fife miners, who transfers. He's described as not particularly brainy but very gallant, and in fact emerges as one of the outstanding tunnelling company commanders when he's given his own company. So you may recognise Stanley Bullock, and with Ralph Hawtrey and James Young. And this is a photograph sent to me just before Christmas last year by the granddaughter of Stanley Bullock. And she'd mentioned a while ago that she had some photographs, but she didn't think they'd be very interesting. But she would get around to sending to me. And through the post arrived several photographs, including this photograph. And if you're really sharp-eyed, you will have noticed this very same carpet appearing in other photographs of men at Albert, 179 Tunnelling Company and others. And on the back is simply the date, 28th of June, 1916. And on 28th of June, personnel of 179 Tunnelling Company left Albert, where they were billeted, for their allotted positions for the attack scheduled to begin the following day. And the officers went to Divisional HQ to collect their orders, which told them the time of 0 and when they were to fire their mines or open up Russian saps, these saps that had been prepared under no man's land. So James Young, Captain James Young, was a section commander on the right-hand side of the La Boiselle sector. He was responsible for the 27-ton Lochnagar mine. James Young's a mining engineer from Kilmarnock. There's no evidence that he'd ever even left Scotland before the war. He's going to fire that mine, the largest mine that is blown on the 1st of July. And Bullock and Hawtrey are going to blow a smaller camouflage, each a 3.5-ton camouflage that's been laid in the British mine system, two camouflages laid to destroy the German mine system simultaneously. And their orders tell them that they must blow at 7:20. And Hawtrey was the sub-manager of a coal mine in Siberia. He was killed the same day as Geoffrey Thompson, 3rd of September 1916, at High Wood, when they are killed by the same British shell after blowing the push pipe. So what we have here is perhaps a mixture of pride in their achievement over the ensuing 9 months or so, when they've taken on the Germans underground and beaten them. They've got their mines in position. The Germans don't seem to know the mines are there, and their lives have been leading up to this moment. Every waking moment, and probably sleeping moment, has been devoted to this point where they blow the mines that they've placed under or very close to the German front lines. It's reflected, perhaps I think, in their expressions, sense of pride and trepidation, but also the way they're incredibly well turned out. Tunnellers were not known for their smartness, but their boots and Sam Brown belts are well polished. They're not dressed as Tommies for the attack. They're not going to go over the top. And I think this maybe epitomises the spirit of the tunnellers. They got into the front line only to receive an order that the attack, of course, was postponed. And they had to come back to Albert and do the whole thing again for the 1st of July. They, James Young and Bullock, both survived, and Hawtrey, of course, lost his life. So I've overstayed my welcome a little, so thank you for your forbearance.
Like Irish Paddy O, saying Mike Maloney wants to marry me, and so leave the Strand and Piccadilly, or you'll be to blame. For love has fairly drove me silly, hoping you're the same. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell. well, let us swear. It's a long, long way to Tipperary.